Evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's virtual author event with Wragg Sykes, author of Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. Based on the author's first-hand experience at the cutting edge of Paleolithic research and theory, Kindred lays out the first full picture we have of the Neanderthals, from amazing new discoveries changing our view of them forever to the more enduring mysteries of how they lived and died, and the biggest question of them all, the relationship with modern humans. After Rebecca's presentation, we will be accepting audience questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Also, copies of Kindred are available for purchase, courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. We will provide a link in the chat for easy purchase. Now, please allow me to introduce tonight's speaker. Wragg Sykes is a British Paleolithic archaeologist, broadcaster, popular science writer, and author. After obtaining a PhD on the last Neanderthals living in Britain, she worked in France at the Université de Bordeaux. I hope I said that correctly. She frequently writes for the popular media, including Scientific American and Guardian Science blogs. She is also the co-founder of the influential Trailblazers Project, which highlights women archaeologists, paleontologists, and geologists through innovative outreach and collaboration. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I will just get my talk loaded up. Okay. So hopefully that screen is visible for everybody now.
Yep, we can see it.
Super. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for your interest in the talk and in the subject of my book. And so, yes, let's get going on everything Neanderthal. So, where do we begin with Neanderthals? What's the origin? What's the sort of the ground zero for Neanderthals? We have to go back about 165 years to 1856. So this is the 19th century, Victorian period, and we are in Feldhofer Cave in the Neanderthal Valley. So you can see there immediately that's the reason for the name of this species. They actually were first recognized in the Neanderthal, which means Neander Valley in Germany. So this is the point at which we overall as a species first recognized that there had been another kind of human on the earth in our deeper, broader history. So it's actually really important in a history of science context, as well as what we think about human evolution and human origins and where we come from and why that matters to us. So on the left there, that's not actually the Neanderthal cave. It was part of a massive limestone gorge that was being quarried out. And this is another one of the different caves and formations that were there. And it was actually very beautiful and well recognized as a tourist hotspot. You know, people went there just to walk and be inspired. And the original discovery of the Neanderthals from the Feldhofer cave happened by accident. So as the quarrying was going on, the miners were removing clay deposits from inside caves because actually they wanted the limestone and the marble of the surrounding rock, and they were blasting out all this sort of mucky, sticky clay stuff within which they knew that there were sometimes to be found the bones of animals. And it happened that some of the material that was being chucked down the side of the quarry into the bottom of the gorge contained bones that the quarry manager, thankfully, recognized as being something that looked rather human and not, for example, like a bear or something like this. And on the right there, you can see the skull, the top of the skull, which was found along with some parts of the body, long bones and other pieces. But certainly it's very distinctive. You can see there the really classic heavy brow ridge. But yeah, it was the vision of a non-specialist really at that point, that meant these bones were recognised and then handed on up sort of the intellectual food chain to anatomists in Bonn, and then it was published after a year or so of studying. But that actually was not the first Neanderthal that we know of to have been found. It was only the first time it was recognised. So there were actually 2 previous finds rather earlier, in the earlier 19th century. On the left here you have again at the top of the skull, again quite a robust part, but it looks more delicate because it's a child. And there is the jawbone and a piece of the upper jaw there. This is a Neanderthal child. This was found 1836 in Belgium. But while the person who found that, Charles Schmerling, was actually intentionally looking for fossils this time, and sort of digging around in caves in that region, that was not recognised as something out of the ordinary, probably because children's anatomy is just, it's not as clearly distinctive because they haven't kind of grown into their faces yet. So that was sort of found but not recognised. And then on the right, you have a complete skull, which was again found before the Feldhofer find in Germany. This is from Gibraltar. This was found in 1848, but once more, it was pulled out of a quarry just incidentally to work. But in Gibraltar at the time, it's British-owned territory, there was a scientific society to do with the militia, basically. The officers there posted there had a scientific society, and it was brought to their attention, we don't know by whom, and presented to the society by the secretary. So we have like the written record saying skull presented by Lieutenant Edmund Flint, great name. But again, nobody twigged that this was something out of the ordinary, and it was just kept in the stores of the society till after the Feldhofer find had been published. And then by chance, somebody was visiting Gibraltar in 1863 and noticed it. So there's this strange sort of long period of time during which we have no knowledge of any Neanderthal fossils being found, or they may well have been. Then these 2 are found but not recognised, and then it's only rather later that sort of, I guess, people's minds are ready to conceptualise that there were fossil humans of different forms. So this is an interesting sort of, I guess, case study of how science itself was developing as a field, as a discipline, all these different people involved. And that's just the fossils. And so for Neanderthals, while the skeletal remains were found quite early, and people were actually digging in Neanderthal sites in the early 19th century as well and finding the stone tools made by them, there was no connection between those 2 things. In the sites where they were finding stone tools, there was no skeletal remains. So it took until the late 19th century, the 1880s, for there to be stone artifacts found alongside recognisably Neanderthal bones. And at that point, Neanderthals had culture. So there's this sort of weird parallel routes to their discovery as well. So let's fast forward to where we are now, 2021, and why I wrote the book, and why people might be interested. So who were the Neanderthals? Essentially, if we look at this image here, which is from the book, you can see that Neanderthals are actually extremely similar to us. If you have in your mind a preconception of Neanderthals as sort of very stooped or bent over or very ape-like, it really is not the case. There are differences in their bodies, across their bodies, but at the same time, if you look overall at the body plan, you can see that they are completely bipedal, as in they're walking on two legs, they're walking fully upright, and they basically look like another kind of human, which is what they were. That being said, it's quite obvious when you start to look at the detail in that image that there are differences. For example, their rib cage, you can see it flares out, whereas ours is much more sort of straight. So their chests are more barrel shaped and they don't have a waist in the same way that we do. The shape of the hip bones are different, the pelvis, and even, don't know why that's gone ahead. There we are, go back. Even the bones themselves are actually thicker. They're thicker walled. And then if you look at the skull, there are really clear differences there as well. They don't have the chin. If you feel your chin right now, there is a clear bony sort of knobble at the bottom of your jaw. They don't have that, so they have a much more sort of sloping back chin. The whole face is big, and the front part is sort of slightly more pulled forward like this, and then the front of our skulls are actually very vertical, whereas Neanderthals, it's more sloping back, and we have like a balloon head, which is quite unusual in the wider hominin family. So what is that context for Neanderthals, the evolutionary context? Well, this represents 4 million years worth of human evolution, and you can see there is a huge variety of different hominins. So that's ancestral species that are part of our wider group. The time scale obviously also changes there somewhat as we go up through that image, but essentially we can see that we share with Neanderthals are up here. We share a last common ancestor with them, somewhere between around 550 and 765,000 years ago, which on the broader scale of 4 million years is actually really recent. And from that point, we sort of going in parallel and evolving on our own separate ways. But really, because of that recency, that explains why you saw in the picture before quite how similar we really are. You know, they're not originating down at the bottom here with very early Homo species 2 million years ago, or what we call Australopithecine species, which are far more primitive. They are really much more recent compared to, oh dear, why is this going forward? I seem to have a strange timer thing going on with this. Right, we'll ignore it. So that's the context of where they fit into the broader story. And something that is really important to understand about Neanderthals, and that I try to bring out in the book, is that, again, as with preconceptions about Neanderthals as being very primitive or apish, there's also been this really persistent idea that they were most strongly associated with really cold, hyper-Arctic conditions, and that they were sort of specialists for the cold, in the same way that Arctic foxes or musk oxen like this one here are. And that's really not true. Neanderthals did live during colder periods, but as the image here shows, they actually also lived, these blocks of red are warmer periods. This one's not quite so warm. So we're in stage 1 here. I hope you can see my arrow moving on the screen. We're in stage 1, so that's a warm period, and what we call an interglacial right now. You know, there's forests around and the ice sheets are not really far extended south. Then if you go back to around 50,000 years, there's a big drop. That's the last ice age, a little bit warmer, but nowhere near as warm as us. But then if you go back to about 123,000 years ago into what we call stage 5, climate stage 5, this is warm. You know, this is actually warmer than today. So Neanderthals, if we look through their whole span of time that they existed, they were just as much creatures of warmer periods, of the forest, as much as of the steppe and the tundra and things like this. So that's the climate conditions, and you can see the span of time they were actually around for is up to possibly as much as 400,000 years ago. The very earliest Neanderthals are emerging, and there's this up and down of the climate, but they also lived across a really wide spatial range. And so we have Neanderthals from where I am in Wales, across into Europe, down into the Mediterranean, into Central Asia, and even Siberia, really quite far into Eurasia. They're not really a European species at all. They're a Western Eurasian species. And that means that as well as all this up and down in climate, they had a huge range of different sorts of landscapes that they lived in. So that variety, and thinking of Neanderthals as occupying many different sorts of worlds and being adapted to many sorts of different environments, is really important, I think, for people to understand that this is the modern understanding of Neanderthals that archaeologists have. And the other thing that I think I wanted to pull out a lot in writing this book, and the reason to write the book, was that archaeology itself has really transformed. I mean, clearly since the 19th century, the way we dig sites now is very different. You know, back in the day, if you had a cave that was full of stuff and you wanted it out, well, you'd blast it with dynamite and job done in 2 weeks. You know, we don't do that now. You know, the speed of digging is clearly much slower, but even in the past 30, 40 years, the approach to excavation, all the different techniques we have for excavation, the fineness of the detail that we extract while we excavate, and then afterwards as we analyze the materials we find, has just absolutely exploded, really. And so, you know, now we have sites that can be laser scanned, and we have barcoded individual objects that go into gigantic databases, and then you can reconstruct and sort of spatially put them all back again and spin it around and see micro layers. You know, really amazing stuff. And not just that, you know, we also understand as archaeologists now that you can't pick and choose the nice bits from your site and chuck away all the stuff that looks like dross and waste, you know, bits of bone that you don't know what animal it is, because actually it all does have really important information. So now, because we understand, for example, that you must collect all of the pieces of stone that come off while you're knapping something, the reason to do that is because, as you see in this picture down here, it allows you to put things back together, literally like a jigsaw, what we call refitting. And that allows you to unfold in reverse the process of thoughts that Neanderthals, the individual Neanderthals, had as they sat down with a lump of rock and worked out how to approach that rock in terms of taking it apart and getting all the different products they were after, flakes and things. And so we can sort of put it back together and watch that cognitive process unfolding. And when we do that, the level of sophistication we see is massively more than used to be sort of believed. And as well, also, we have just loads of mad, you know, even to archaeologists, they're kind of like mind-boggling, the stuff that goes on now. And this is all very specialized as well. You know, archaeological excavations these days are full of people who specialize in different fields, and that includes things I'm showing in this other picture here on the right, where we have people who are geoarchaeologists, so they're specialists in the sediments inside sites. And what that allows us to do is really cool stuff like taking sediment samples, slices through ancient hearths, and then sort of solidifying them with resin, cutting fine slices through that, and look at it under a microscope. And then you see things like this, which are tiny pieces of burnt bone or burnt wood. And that allows us to build up a picture of how Neanderthal hearths were actually managed, and, you know, different phases of burning within the hearths, and evidence that the hearths had been cleared out and the ash taken and dumped in the site, you know, all these things. Oh, it's skipping again. Anyway, so I think I'd finished that slide. So archaeology itself has also really transformed, and that's important to understand the detail actually of what we can say about Neanderthal life is really quite amazing. And it's because archaeology itself has changed in what we do, but that has a feedback in that our expectations of what we might find in Neanderthal sites now are much wider and richer than they used to be. So what do we find, basically? I mean, there's a whole book that I wrote, and I can't go into all of it in detail today, but let's just say I'm not going to talk about the diet very much because there's just so much of it. But this picture is from the book. The pictures, the illustrations from my book are done by Alison Atkin, who's very talented, and she's also a trained archaeologist. But to sort of give the brief picture, Neanderthals ate a much more varied diet than used to be believed, and they definitely hunted big game, but also small game. They seem to have been eating birds now and then, probably fish sometimes, certainly marine resources that they're collecting from the shores and things like this, and plants as well. Plants are a big new area, but again, I'm not going to go into that here. Something else, I've already been mentioning how we understand what we need to do as archaeologists with the stone tools that Neanderthals made when we find them and collect them. But doing that, taking that holistic approach, means that we understand so much better that Neanderthals were really far from this cliche of, you know, cave people smacking rocks together and just hoping that they'll get a sharp bit. What we actually see when we take a systematic approach to studying the material they produce is that they were really, really aware of stone as a material. They understood all different kinds of stone. They treated them differently. They never took bad stone out of, you know, the region where they found it. They only transported the good stuff, and there is a whole range of different ways of taking stone apart that they had mastered. They were very systematic in what they knew they wanted in terms of the product, the kind of ergonomics of particular flakes, and quite often we see different technological systems focused around how much they wanted to be able to resharpen their tools, which is linked to mobility in the landscape and the need to move around and things like this. So understanding how their stone tools worked is really important for opening questions about their wider lifestyle. And this image from the book is kind of just to make the point that certainly for some of their technological systems, they're more like production line efficiency than sort of just random smacking of stones. And so that's important. And taking this theme really of engaging with materials, this is something I think that's really striking when, having taken a large scale perspective in writing this book, it's very obvious that Neanderthals were interested in all sorts of different materials and highly attuned to the different properties of materials and able to creatively engage with that and even experiment sometimes. So apart from the stone napping and what we call making of stone tools, so there's a biface there on the left, a nice hand axe, that you have things made much later in the States from Paleo-Indian sites, and they look a little bit similar to this one, but they're not the same. But then we also have, for example, Neanderthals in other places making tools from shell. They use the same technological know-how that they apply to stone, but in some places they do it with shell. So that's very interesting. It's flexible. And then Also bone. That used to be thought that Neanderthals didn't really do much with bone, maybe because they weren't clever enough. Basically, that idea has really kind of fallen by the wayside. Certainly, they didn't do masses of bone working, but in some places they were making objects that make it very clear that they were well aware of the properties of different bones within individual animals, differences between species. And this collection down here of different, these are the tips of different bone tools. These are probably skin working tools, what we would call lissoir, where you're sort of softening, perhaps burnishing to waterproof animal skins. And in that case, it's been shown that they were going after ribs for a start, because they already had a nice bendy sort of shape. But in particular, these tools are coming from sites where there was loads of reindeer, but they're being made on the ribs of large bovids. So that's either bison or the wild cattle called aurochs. So they're really selective, and that matches what we see in how they treat animal carcasses as a food resource as well. And the butchery is always very systematic. They know which are the richest parts of the body, not just meaty, but the fatty parts, the marrow-rich parts, and those are the bits that they consistently take with them away from kill sites. Go back. So if we move around then to another kind of material that Neanderthals were engaging with, plants. You know, I did mention that they ate plants more than we used to believe, but also they understood plants as another kind of resource. And there are some fascinating discoveries. Obviously, plants and wood don't survive as well as stone does. So those finds are always going to be much more rare, but they do exist. And we can see some of them here. So this weird looking thing that looks like a cleaver you might find in your kitchen at the bottom, that's actually a cast of this impression. Just below it, you can see the black stuff in it is the remains of burnt wood. And this comes from a really amazing site that I talk about a lot in the book because it is just so fantastic. It's a Spanish site called Abric-Romani, and it has really unusual preservation where successively through about 12 meters, 20,000 years of time, every so often Neanderthals would live there for a while. Then the site's water table would rise, and a layer of flowstone, like calcium carbonate, same stuff that stalactites are made from, that would form over the site and basically seal it. And then organic things would largely rot inside that, and it would make casts, just like the bodies at Pompeii. So that's what you're seeing down there. That's the cast of a wooden tool. And when the archaeologists found the cast, they did what they did at Pompeii and sort of filled it, and that's what came out. So that is really unexpected. It seems to be a tool made of wood with its own integrated handle. What it was used for, no idea. But it's opening up a world of wooden tools that's unexpected, I think. Again, up here on the left, this is a really dramatic object. It is what it looks like. It's a spear tip from a site in Germany. So that wooden thing down at the bottom from Abric-Romani is about 50,000 years old, 55. This long wooden spear tip is from Schöningen, this German site, which is 330,000 years old, so much older. But the woodworking is really, really fine. So there's numerous spears from this site. It's a lakeshore site, a really lovely preservation. And what we can see from detailed study of those objects is that Neanderthals knew about the different properties within trees, basically. And consistently, we can see that they are not only choosing for the tips of the spears, the lower parts of the branches, or in fact the base of the trunk, which is the hardest wood, but those spears are also manufactured slightly offset from the grain of the wood, so they don't go straight up and down, and that also makes them more robust to impact damage, so they're not going to split so much. And that that is a level of understanding of wood and craftsmanship that's not really that far off carpentry in some ways. And it's not just spears that are treated like that. We also have finds from elsewhere of digging sticks, which don't sound quite so exciting, but the same level of care and attention is put into those as well. And why not? Because actually digging sticks are really important tools. And if Neanderthals are eating more plants than we used to think, then that's going to be a really important part of their calories. And then down at the bottom here, this is a really fascinating recent find, which sort of opens up another world of interaction with plants. This is from a French site called Abri du Maras. It's about, I think, 90,000 years old. And it appears to be a very tiny piece of 3-ply sort of thread. It's been described as like cord or twine, but cord makes me think of something that's quite thick. The fineness of this is much more like thread. And analysis of that using chemical analysis, that was found to be basically conifer, either conifer bark or possibly conifer root. And certainly, from indigenous cultures in the Americas, there is abundant evidence that people knew very well how to make cordage and thread from spruce roots. And so, the existence of such an object is not an impossibility, but coming from a Neanderthal site, if it is a real object, because some people have said, is this just something that you could create by accident? But if you look at the picture, it has a 3-ply twist. So it's twisted, made of 3 separate fibers that are themselves twisted one direction. And then the 3 of those are twisted together in another direction. That's quite hard to imagine how that happens by accident. So if that is a real find, and there's no reason to doubt it, I don't think, then it really does open a lot of suggestions as to what Neanderthals are doing with such fine fibers, and I don't know. And then finally up here, just another case of these rare finds, unique finds, but which open a window into a richer world. This is a tiny little scrap on a stone tool from another German site. This is from that warm period I was telling you about 120,000 years ago, when everything was forested. And this turned out to have a load of oak tannins in it when that was analysed. And if you know anything about leather production, skin working, oak tannins are a great way to make leather. And as far as we can tell, it's not something that would occur naturally in that context where it was found. And the implication is that this flake was perhaps attached to a handle or something else that was being used to work animal skins that had a oak tannin solution applied to them for the purpose of leather making. And it just soaked in and happened to be preserved because tannins preserve things. So another example of finds that, although they are unique, they really show sort of the diversity of the material world that Neanderthals knew about that we just don't see much of. Then we get on to sort of more unusual, interesting, difficult to explain things. And what I call, rather than saying it art or symbolic, I try to come at this from a material perspective again and think about as material aesthetics. Neanderthals is interested in changing the appearance of things or the surfaces of things. So again, we have a range of different things that are going on. They're not common, but they are persistently present at a number of sites through time. So first category of things basically is the use of mineral pigments, colour basically. And it does seem that Neanderthals are interested in blacks, reds, oranges, yellows, and sometimes they're applied to things. Sometimes we just find the lumps, but sometimes they're on some shells, which is interesting. Those shells may or may not have been food waste. But what is more interesting is that the pigment is a mix of colours. You know, it's not just one kind of red ochre. They've got stuff from different sources and mixed it together with the addition apparently of iron pyrite, so that's fool's gold, which would give a sparkling sort of effect. So we don't know what is going on with that, but the fact that they are experimenting with materials is quite clear and changing the appearance of things. Then you kind of get cases where you have pigments applied to unusual objects. So this is a fossil shell from Italy, a very small shell, nothing to do with food. So that's an unusual object in itself. And Neanderthal found that object 100 kilometers away in a geological deposit from where it was eventually excavated at the Grotta Fermane in Italy. And that fossil shell also has red pigment on the outside only. So that's two different unusual things together in that one object. Similarly, people might have heard some discussion in recent years about Neanderthals and birds, and possibly Neanderthals being interested in feathers and things like this. And that's one sort of angle on non-food related bird interest that they had. There does seem to be something going on with them collecting wings and possible feathers and things, including very large predatory birds. So this is a talon of a white-tailed eagle from Krapina, and this is probably about 130,000 years old, and interesting in itself because it's one of a number from a single site, but this one was recently found to again have a mix of pigments on it, with clay as well in this case. So that is a really significant object, I think, for understanding that Neanderthals are interested in changing objects, surfaces, appearances. Then we have another class of interactions where we can see rare cases, but again, multiples of them through the whole span of Neanderthal existence, where they are making regularized incisions or engravings on different materials. So this is a hyena bone. There's also the bone of a raven from another site. And this is what seems to be engravings in the floor of a cave. So not sort of wall art, but changing the surface, making some kind of markings. What's going on with these is very hard to say. It may be some kind of notational aspect, but we can't really be sure. But the intentionality is there, and there's been interesting work that's been done, certainly on the hyena bone, which makes it quite clear that they are trying to regularize the spaces between those incisions. So aesthetics, entanglements with different materials, this is a key part of the modern understanding of Neanderthals. There have been some suggestions for representational art based on some dates from Spanish sites. This is being contested by other dating specialists who work on the earliest known art, which currently is from Eastern Asia. So I'm not quite sure about that. So this was this line was dated, and this sort of image looks a bit like a ladder, and that came out, I think, earlier than 64,000 years old. And similarly, this little lump next to the negative image of a hand from another Spanish site was dated very early, at a point at which we don't think any Homo sapiens were in the region. However, even if you discount those cases, and this is just a handprint from a French site, sort of with preserved dunes, where there's loads of Neanderthal footprints. It's absolutely amazing. And there's also this handprint. The Neanderthals did probably recognize their own handprints. But even if you put aside these claims for painted images being created on walls, we already know from the stuff that I've just showed you that Neanderthals are interested in color. They're interested in changing surfaces. They're interested in making incisions and regularized patterns. And so it's not so outlandish that they might have been doing this. And they're doing other very weird stuff that no one else is doing. This is a site from France called Bruniquel, a very deep cavern about 300 meters into a hill. And there are huge rings, these big rings here, one here, with piles. And this is all broken off stalagmites. And it turns out, after this has been studied, not only are these pieces, they seem to have been selected by size and weight. So they're not just randomly smashing stuff up. They're choosing them, but also they're not just sort of pushing piles of stuff around. Because if you look in detail at the constructions themselves, you can see pieces are stacked like this. And then there's even pieces balanced on top of each other within those big rings. So this is really some kind of construction. We don't know what it's for. We don't know what the Neanderthals are doing, but this is definitely dated at about 174,000 years old. So absolutely mind-blowing. It's among archaeologists, I think it's one of the favorites, because it's just like, what is going on? We don't know. It's amazing. I did actually want my slide to change there, so that was good. I won't go too much into the burial aspect. We can talk about it a bit in the questions, because I know I'm going to be running out of time soon. But suffice it to say that, as with everything else about Neanderthals, the picture of what's going on has got more complicated and also more interesting, I think. So even in the earliest days of excavation, when Neanderthal bodies and skeletons were found, people were speculating about burials. And it was assumed, actually, that when you see things like this, which is La Ferracie 1, so this is from southeast France, this was found in 1908, that was assumed that maybe that was a burial. Obviously, you can see that that body is not laying out straight in any kind of neat grave-like form. But we can't make assumptions like that when we find skeletons, or indeed when we look back at photos like this, because there are many different ways that bodies can end up in caves, and we need to always be quite conservative. And all the way through this talk, when I've been talking about all these different things Neanderthals do, archaeologists always take a conservative view and say, well, could it be this? Could it be this? And that's certainly also true with, you know, the dealings with the dead. What are they doing with the dead? How do these bodies end up in sites? And really great work that I talk about a lot in the book, and I use case studies, is where archaeologists today have gone back to these classic sites and sort of reassessed them, reinterpreted the remains that are there. So this here is La Chapelle au Son. This is another French site that was excavated basically the same time as this one. And we can see here, this is what was claimed to be a burial pit within which the body of an older male Neanderthal was found. There's the little picnic basket, you know, your Edwardian type excavation. Archaeologists went back recently, re-excavated all the trash out of the site. They found that depression. This is the modern version of the picnic basket. This is the case for their laser surveying kit. I love how it's in the same place. And using all of the modern techniques and analyses of sediment and things like this available, what they could say is it does appear that this depression may have been made or extended after Neanderthals had already been living in that cave. And certainly the condition of the Neanderthals' bones is also different to the condition of the animal bones in all the surrounding layers that built up over it. So something interesting was going on in that site. It's very difficult to get at it now because all the stuff's come out. However, if you have other sites where you still have intact sediments, then you can really reassess those. And so on the right here, this is a case in point. This is from a very famous site called Shanidar in Iraqi Kurdistan now. And this was excavated in the 60s by American archaeologists, and they uncovered multiple different Neanderthal remains. They were largely interpreted as some of them potential burial, some of them maybe rockfall deaths. And there was also claims that maybe there had been flower bouquets because pollen was found in the burials and things. It was all very exciting, but also contested over time. So what has happened more recently is a team from the University of Cambridge have been invited to go back, and they took off where that excavation finished in the 60s and have found new remains, which are probably other parts of some of the partial skeletons found in the 60s. But what's really important is that they are still in the sediment. They could be excavated really finely. Everything can be, done to the extreme that we can manage for our modern excavation. And also importantly, sediment analysis can be done to work out, how did that body get in the ground? Is the surrounding sediment different to the rest of the sediment in the cave? Does it appear that there was a depression? Was it sort of cut? Things like this. So all of that will really now allow us to pick apart the question of, did they bury their dead, in a way that might be recognizable? And the answer is probably sometimes yes. But they're doing other stuff as well. And this is a real recent trend that's fascinating. Some people find it gory, but I think that's because we have quite rigid ideas about what's the correct thing to do with the dead, and that's very cultural. What people do with the dead all over the world is very variable. So it turns out that in some places, more than you might expect, Neanderthals were taking apart the bodies of the dead, basically butchering them. Sometimes it does look as if they are actually eating them. Other cases, we're not quite sure if that's happening. But fascinatingly, they are sometimes also using some of the bones to make stone tools with, because when you make stone tools, you can either use a stone hammer, or you can also use bone to take off different flakes. Basically, it's just another way of knapping. And they are using these pieces. And given the clear anatomical knowledge that Neanderthals had and their understanding of different animal bodies, it's very difficult to believe that they didn't know what they are doing. And we can also see in some cases that they're doing it when the bone is fresh. That's interesting, and it would fit with what we see in different cultures throughout history across the world. This is not something that's actually that abnormal to do this. But then you get these other really interesting things going on. So here is a skull from France, or rather the pieces, these two pieces from a skull. The skull appears, these cut marks here, it looks like it was taken apart and butchered, but this stuff here, this is evidence that this piece was also used to make tools. However, it's actually not a very good choice if you want to have what we call a retoucher, a bone tool for making other stone tools. It's the only piece of skull that was used as a retoucher from any species in any Neanderthal site. It's been used despite its unsuitability. And I think that is a clue that something else is going on here. And similarly, this is from another site where there's abundant body processing, but this skull here is from Krapina, the same site actually where the eagle talon is from, but perhaps from a different layer. And this, again, this individual was probably butchered, taken apart. We don't know the circumstances of that, but on the top of the head, there are over 30 really fine incisions going over the top here. Nothing to do with butchery. You don't get that by skinning. This is something much more similar to what we saw on those pieces of animal bone, this really intentional marking of a surface. Notational, not sure, but it's doing something with the skull. And when you look at the importance of faces and heads to our social interactions, not just us, but other animals, primates, perhaps there's a pattern here of an interest in this part of the body of the deceased. So that was a bit of a speedy whiz through, and I know I've talked slightly over what we were intending with the 30-minute talk. But just to say, so what are the differences then? What are we left with if Neanderthals are doing all this really cool, amazing stuff? What we don't see so far is anything that looks like this. This is a sculpture. It's clearly a sculpture of a human body. This is from a German site just after the Neanderthals disappear from the record about 40,000 years ago. This is, I think, about 41,000 years. So over that period, it's basically at the point they're gone. We don't see anything like this that's representational, a clear form of another sort of thing in the world. Similarly here, this is the oldest dated art in the world at the moment, from Eastern Asia, from Indonesia. Nothing like that at all. We don't even see things like this. This is on ostrich eggshell from South Africa. This is dated about 80,000 years. Homo sapiens is very regular, very geometric, very stylized. There's nothing like that from Neanderthals. And although there have been claims that Neanderthals, very late Neanderthals, perhaps with contact with Homo sapiens, might have made pendants, those contexts I don't believe are that secure. And there's nothing else like this from earlier Neanderthal sites at all. And although we have a lot of interesting things going on with bodies, what we don't have are any cases of skeletons, intact skeletons with loads of stuff left with them like this. There's a couple of potential bits and bobs, like a deer's jaw, but nothing like this where you've got loads of worked beads and stuff. So these things do represent a difference. And I'm not going to talk about what that might mean for why the Neanderthals disappeared and we did not, and all of this, because that's like a whole hour's talk in itself. But this is what you can take away from it. So just to really finish, and I guess bring together all the different things that we're thinking about in the big picture, not only of what we think about Neanderthals now, but this whole historical shift in thought over 160 odd years. We can actually just quickly look at some of the changes in reconstruction, because it's so powerful, I think, and it really is a reflection of that feedback loop between archaeology and cultural imaginings. So here, this is actually the first ever sketch of a Neanderthal done in 1864 by Thomas Huxley. This is based on that skull from Gibraltar only. So he's imagining actually a very apish body with a little tail, but with actually a nice little hafted axe. And this one here in the middle was based on the Feldhofer find, but still quite sort of apish. And then you get to the early 20th century, the 1930s, and Neanderthals looking a lot more human, but look how depressed this guy looks. He just does not look happy to be in the world. He looks like he's waiting to be extinct, basically. And this trend was there, overall, and it really persists until about the mid 20th century. And then in the later 20th century, as we start to get the impact of changes in archaeological thought and archaeological practice, we now have much more sophisticated reconstructions of Neanderthals, which really are based in the archaeology. So this is the work of Mauricio Anton. We've got a little bit of pigment here. We've got a nice spear, even a shell. This is a woman hunting. Again, we've got the pigment and a hafted spear. And here, I really like this one because there is good evidence that the Neanderthals were doing things with animal skins, and some thermal studying suggesting sometimes they did actually need some clothing. And also I like the fact that there's a child there, because they're often just not part of the picture. So this is really nice. And then this is fantastic. This is the work of Tom Bjerkland, a Finnish artist. And I like his work because of the portraits he does of Neanderthals, but he's also really good at placing Neanderthals in their world, having them look comfortable, you know, having them look as if they are just going about their business. They're successful at what they're doing. They're knowledgeable. And so this piece here in a birch forest is inspired, I think, by the fact that we know Neanderthals made birch tar and adhesive. So again, I could talk about that just by itself for ages, but we'll carry on. And then these sculptures are done by two brothers, the Kennis brothers, really famous sculptors and artists. And these pieces, I think, personify for me the biggest change in how we think about Neanderthals, in that there is a confidence there. There's a confidence that they are giving our gaze back to us, but also they look confident in themselves, and they are also allowed to smile and to love each other and to have relationships. And I think that is the point at which we've now reached, that Neanderthals are understood for their own sake. They're interesting for their own sake, not just because they came before us or whatever. And that's the kind of impression that I really hope people will get after they read the book. And then obviously we can't sort of talk about Neanderthals without mentioning interbreeding. But for me, I think this is really, and this image is sort of a genetics figure that shows here's Homo sapiens, and these branches here are what seem to be multiple late interbreeding events coming from Neanderthals into us. Here is a very early one from us into Neanderthals. The fact that we now know that there was this interbreeding, I think, really changed people's relationships now with Neanderthals, in how we feel about them and what they mean. So in that sense, the contexts for these meetings, we don't know what they were, but there's no reason to assume that violence and conflict was always the foundational baseline for the interbreeding. I think we should assume what we see from all the rest of the Neanderthal record, that there's variety and diversity going on. And, you know, why not see Neanderthals as maybe beautiful? This is one of Tom Bjerkland's portraits. You know, she's dreaming. Why is she not beautiful, you know? And, you know, he's got a glint in his eye. I always say that if any Neanderthal is a little bit sexy, this guy is. So that's where I want to leave it. You know, let's reimagine Neanderthals from the archaeology and everything else. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry I went on a little bit long.
And I just say thank you so much for your presentation. I thought this was absolutely fascinating and a fresh look into the life of Neanderthals, because as we were talking about before this, I graduated 10 years ago with a Bachelor's of Science in Anthropology, and so much has changed in our knowledge of Neanderthals since then. It's because of how quickly technology is changing and what we can do. That's so cool. Now, I know you're in Wales, and I know you're probably really tired, but do you have time for a few questions?
I've got an adrenaline rush now. I'm all right.
Okay. I'll try to condense them into some, okay. So first, let's go back to the family tree a little bit. And I know that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are two distinct lineages. What do we know about the common ancestor that we came from? Do we know much about them?
It's a really good question. We have a slightly sparse fossil record in Africa during that period, sort of 700-ish to about 500,000-ish. We don't know where the population was, that common ancestral population from which the lineages that would become us and that would become Neanderthals actually was physically based. What we do know is that by 430,000 years ago, so this is just before Neanderthals, we have a Spanish site called the Sierra de Atapuerca, and that has remains of individuals that look a bit like they're going towards Neanderthals, and we have genetics from there as well, which says the same thing, that they're like proto-Neanderthals. So that's definitely in Europe. And there are no remains of anything that look like Homo sapiens outside of Africa before 180,000 years ago. So things have got a lot more complicated more recently, and in that it seemed to be that, you know, a few decades ago, you might be able to say, oh, well, we left, we dispersed from Africa at 50,000, 40,000 years ago, and the Neanderthal disappeared. That's not the case now. We have Homo sapiens looking stuff in Eurasia significantly earlier, but we believe that those two lineages were separate for a long time. And then the Homo sapiens came into Eurasia, and that's when you have this interbreeding that then starts going on through time, the earliest of which seems to be about 200,000 years. So that's a complicated answer. But yeah, we don't know that much about the source population, other than the fact that they were probably in Africa or potentially like the Near East. But that's all we can say, really.
So nevertheless, that's so fascinating. And I know that, you know, as we find new sites and new fossils, like, it will change our opinion and it changes our history of it. So it's constantly evolving.
Yes. And also, as we get better at getting older DNA, that's going to be interesting.
Right. So speaking of DNA, we got a couple of questions about DNA. I know if you take one of the Ancestry DNA tests, it can tell you if you have Neanderthal in your DNA. I know some people that took the test and they have that. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been and research-wise in terms of Neanderthal DNA research about their genome? If a human has Neanderthal DNA, are there any physical traits that they tend to have? Anything interesting like that?
Well, I have to say straight up, I'm not a genetic specialist. I am a stone tool specialist, but overall, the DNA picture seems to be that the percentage is sort of shrunk a little bit as we have had more fossil samples, and, you know, as the databases have got better. Some of the early estimates were like 4% or something. It's not as much now. It's more like 1 to maybe 2.5, something like that. So from that perspective, it sounds quite little, and that's not evenly distributed either amongst living people. So that's people mostly of Eurasian descent originally who have that. It did appear that if you had a sub-Saharan African background, that there didn't seem to be any Neanderthal DNA at all. There now looks like there might be a really minuscule bit, but it's probably from later migrations back into Africa from Eurasian Homo sapiens that had that ancestry, and it's going back into African populations. So it does actually look as if probably everybody in the world has got some Neanderthal ancestry, but the amounts are different. In terms of, like, you know, people always like to say, oh, I've got a neighbor, he just looks really Neanderthal. It's not quite as simple as that. There have been some studies that have been done that suggest maybe there is some differences in skull shape and stuff, but it's at a population scale. It's not like you couldn't just look at someone and go, oh yeah, he definitely is. You know, so it's more sort of subtle, I think. And similarly, trying to understand what the Neanderthal DNA that we have, what it actually does for us, is also really complicated, partly because we are still trying to understand the interplay between our genetics and how our bodies actually function and all that complexity. So it's very early days, I think, to be able to say, well, we kept this bit of Neanderthal DNA because it was good for us, and it does this because, well, maybe it does something today, but that might not be the reason why it was useful 50,000 years ago. So with the genetics, it's really fascinating, and it has opened so many doors into how we think about past population interaction. But I think we're at quite a preliminary stage to understand what it means physically, I think.
Right. I think that's another thing that's going to take some time. And as research develops, just like how we built our own genome, like that we will know more about the Neanderthal DNA and what it represents. I think it's fascinating, though. It's so cool. Speaking a little bit more from a physiological standpoint, do we know anything about how Neanderthals may have communicated with one another? Is there anything in their bone structure that can represent they had the ability to communicate?
Yes. What we know is that some of the notions that Neanderthal anatomy was basically a bit rubbish for speech, those are much less well supported now. So some of the best evidence that we have comes from what we call hyoid bones, which basically support like your voice box and your vocal apparatus. And we do have a couple of those, one from the sort of proto-Neanderthals and also from a full Neanderthal site. And those, if you sort of model where they are and sort of put back all the soft tissue, it makes the result is that it looks as if they could probably make really quite a similar range of sounds to us, unlikely to be identical, but much more similar than what a chimp can do. Basically, their throats different. And I think more recent research has been really interesting on not just like the ability to make sounds, but to hear. And this has been work that's been done looking at skulls, where actually some of the anatomy inside the ear is bony and it's preserved. And if you look at that, the shape is actually a bit different to ours, but it seems that that's because, as I was saying, their whole skull shape is different, and it's kind of morphed for that reason. But if you model the sound frequencies that those ears would be able to be tuned into, they turn out to be very similar to ours, and ours are really tuned into human speech. That's what our ears are great at hearing. So that fact suggests that some kind of vocal communication was really important in everyday life for Neanderthals. And if we both have that, it also suggests that the common ancestor had something rather similar. And we can even, some more really recent work has suggested that that Neanderthals were certainly able to pick up sort of consonant sounds, like soft consonant sounds, like t, k, that kind of sound, which is person to person talking it. You can't hear that across a valley. And that also is really interesting in terms of the interbreeding and how easy would it have been for different populations to try to make themselves understood, and also for hybrid children being raised in whichever group they were raised in, because we know both options were going on. How easy was it for them to actually communicate with their parent and with their siblings and other members of the group? And certainly some of those hybrid children went on to have their own children, because that's how we have the DNA in us. They weren't infertile, all of them. So the evidence for some sort of talking is definitely there anatomically. But also you can look at the archaeology and say, well, how complicated is their life? What are these different skills? Could you learn all that? Could you know all that without some kind of informational content in the language that's quite sophisticated? So that's a whole other area that I could talk about as well, but I've already taken a long time on this answer.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, though, and you brought up a great point about the hybrid children and how they would have. I just think it's so cool. I geek out about this stuff. Okay, I want to end on one last question because, like I said, I know you're probably tired. But Lisa wants to know, and I know you said that one of your most interesting or favorite finds is the ring in the cave, but she really thinks your presentation has been awesome because your findings have really humanized Neanderthals that you've discussed tonight. And other than the ring in the cave, is there anything you didn't discuss tonight that really shaped your personal opinion about Neanderthals?
I think probably the birch tar. Actually, I didn't really talk about that much. But the fact that birch tar and adhesives. Okay, so glue is like, glue, what? It's a bit boring. But actually, the fact that Neanderthals were making adhesives and glue has a load of different implications. One is the fact that there is this really basic fundamental stage in technological evolution where you suddenly make multi-component objects that you stick pieces together, and you have to make those different things. You have to then get the idea to stick them together. It's going to have a new functionality. So Neanderthals definitely were doing that, and they were doing it early. The oldest evidence that we have for the use of birch tar as a handle rather than a glue for like a 3-piece tool is probably about 250, maybe 300,000 years old from an Italian site. But birch tar itself is also interesting because it's not a natural product. Like if you go in a forest, you know, people probably know, you see pine resin dripping out of trees. It's sticky, it's there. Birch tar is not like that. You have to cook it out of the bark. It's a manufactured synthetic product. So that has a whole other sort of scattering of implications about cognition and experimentation. So that's interesting. But a particular object, the first recognized birch tar, was only sort of actually, I think, chemically tested properly in, I think, 2001 maybe. It was a find that was older, but when it was found out to be birch tar, it was all interesting. But those objects themselves come from a German site called Königsau. It's about 80,000 years old. It's a lakeshore site, and there's 2 lumps. One is really cool because it's a lump with what looks like the impression of a piece of wood, so possibly the handle of the tool, and on the other side it's got like the impression of the stone tool. So that really does look like it's a bit that's sticking things together. And also there's a thumbprint on that, which is amazing. So that one gets attention. But then this other piece of birch tar from the same site, I really like it because it looks a bit more dull initially. It's just sort of a little rolled up blob. But birch tar, you make it and then it cools, but you can reheat it and soften it up and make it again and use it to repair tools. So this other piece looks like a piece of plasticine. It's like been rolled and then formed over on itself and pinched. And that suggests that those pieces were not made at that place. They had been made somewhere else, and they were maybe part of a little toolkit of resources that were taken around the landscape. So again, it's where I like things where it's like a single object, but it makes you go, oh my gosh, you start seeing like a whole landscape of what they're up to. And so those are why I like those particular pieces.
Well, especially because there's like a chain of events, and so it really builds to the overall, oh my gosh, it's not just a sticky adhesive, there's something much more to this.
And overall, Neanderthals, I think, compared to what's going on earlier than Neanderthals, their world is, they are expanding the scale at which they operate across the landscape, but also through time, with these objects that are made of many different parts that come together that you can then, you know, repair, and it has another generation and things like this. So what they're doing is expanding where they are in space. They have projects that last for days, but also through time, and you have the potential for, I guess, people's memories actually to expand. And this tool used to have another handle and things like this. So I think that's also really interesting.
It absolutely is. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time this evening and sharing your knowledge and your research. And I know there are some questions we didn't get to, but to try and lump the entire history and culture of an entire species in 60 minutes is near impossible. Even if we were doing one about one of the Australopithecines, we couldn't do it in 60 minutes, and we know much less about them. So I recommend everybody go out and get a copy of Kindred. If you can't purchase it, we have copies in the chat, but you can also get it from your local library. It is a fantastic resource. Trust me, someone with an anthropology degree, this is a fantastic resource and just an examination of Neanderthals, their life, some physiology information, as well as their culture. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for your time this evening. I hope you can get some rest now.
No, thank you so much to everybody for coming along and listening. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Good night.